The plate hit the table before her like a declaration of war. Annie Wells stood in the doorway of the Redemption Creek Town Hall, her worn leather satchel clutched against her ribs, her jaw set so hard she could feel her back teeth aching. Every head in that room had turned toward her when she walked in, every single one, and not a soul had moved to make space, not the banker's wife with her pearl buttons and her tight little smile. Not the reverend's daughter who had the manners of a saint on Sundays and the cruelty of a cat the rest of the week. Not the ranchers who lined the long oak table like kings at a feast. Not one person in that packed room had shifted so much as an inch to offer Annie Wells a seat at the table, where the town's annual harvest supper was being laid out. She had known they wouldn't. She had told herself on the walk over from the boarding house that it didn't matter, that she had survived worse, that she was only here because Mrs. Calloway had paid her a quarter to deliver a message to the Reverend, and she had meant to leave the envelope and go. But then the smell of roasted chicken and cornbread had hit her, and her stomach had reminded her, in no uncertain and deeply humiliating terms, that she had not eaten since yesterday morning. She stood there for 10 full seconds. She counted them. 10 seconds while 23 people in Redemption Creek, Colorado looked at her the way you look at something that has wandered onto your porch uninvited. A stray dog. A bad omen. The woman nobody wanted and everybody had an opinion about. Annie Wells, who had ridden into town 3 weeks ago with 40 cents, a forged letter of reference, and a name that no one in Colorado recognized yet. Annie Wells, who had taken a room at the boarding house and asked about work at every establishment on the main street and been turned away from 17 of them. Annie Wells, who had in the past week begun to understand with a cold and specific clarity what it meant to be truly alone in a place where people already knew whose side they were on. She was turning to leave. She had made the calculation. The quarter would buy her a tin of beans. She would be fine. And then the plate came down. Not gently, not tentatively. It came down with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had made a decision and intended everyone in the room to understand it. A full plate, steaming hot, heaped with chicken and roasted corn and a thick slab of fresh bread, set at the very end of the long harvest table, at the only gap between 2 chairs. And standing behind it, one hand still flat on the table, his dark eyes moving slowly across the room like a man taking inventory of a situation he fully intended to resolve, was United States Marshal David McCrae. He pulled the chair out. He looked directly at Annie Wells. "Ma'am," he said, and the single word carried more dignity than everything else that had happened in that room combined. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And Annie Wells, who had not cried in 4 years and had no intention of starting now, felt something crack open in the center of her chest that she had no name for and no defense against. She walked to the chair. She sat down. David McCrae picked up his own plate from where he had already set it at the head of the table and moved it to the seat beside her, sitting down last, after her, as though this were the most natural arrangement in the world and anyone who thought differently was welcome to take it up with his badge. She had not known him then. Not really. She had seen him twice in passing, knew his name the way you knew any lawman's name in a frontier town, because survival depended on knowing who held the guns and the authority. She had not known that David McCrae had a dark past of his own that he carried like a stone in his coat pocket. She had not known that his decision to set her plate down before his own would change both of their lives in ways that neither of them could have predicted or defended against. She had not known that she was about to fall in love with him so completely and so helplessly that every wall she had ever built would come down, one by one, until there was nothing left between her heart and his. But that is where the story truly begins. 6 weeks before that night, Annie Wells had been standing on a train platform in St. Louis, Missouri, with everything she owned in one carpetbag, and a decision she had made 3 days earlier still burning in her chest like a coal that wouldn't cool. She was 26 years old. She had been born in Nashville to a preacher father who believed in the Bible and believed in discipline, and did not, when it came to his eldest daughter, distinguish meaningfully between the two. She had grown up quieter than she should have been, more watchful, with a particular skill for reading rooms and understanding danger before it made itself known. She had married at 19 because her father had selected the man, and because the alternative had been made brutally clear to her, and she had spent 4 years in that marriage learning that the world contained a very specific kind of cruelty that wore a respectable face and sat in the front pew every Sunday. Her husband, Thomas Carver, had not been a violent man in the way that word usually meant. He had never left a mark. He was far too careful for that, far too concerned with his reputation in the community of Benton, Missouri, where he ran a dry goods store and was considered a pillar of civic virtue. His cruelty had been of the quiet variety, the kind that dismantled a person one small piece at a time. He controlled the money absolutely. He controlled who Annie spoke to, who she wrote letters to, whether she was permitted to leave the house on a given day. He had a way of speaking to her in front of other people that sounded perfectly pleasant and simultaneously communicated that she was stupid, inferior, and fortunate to have him. She had left him on a Tuesday morning in September of 1883, while he was at the store. She had taken the carpetbag she had been quietly packing for 3 months, the 42 cents she had hidden in the lining of her winter coat, and a letter she had written to herself 6 months earlier on a night when she had genuinely believed she might not survive the year if she stayed. The letter had said simply that she deserved better. She had needed to put it in writing because there had been days when she could not make herself believe it. She had forged the letter of reference herself, not because she was comfortable with dishonesty, but because 4 years of Thomas Carver had taught her that the world did not give women like her clean options. She had used the name of a women's society in St. Louis whose stationery she had once seen in a magazine, and she had written herself a recommendation as a seamstress of good character and industrious habits, which was at least partially true. She could sew well. The character and habits she was doing her best to maintain. She had chosen Colorado because Thomas would not follow her to Colorado. He would not follow her anywhere that required effort, because effort directed outside his business was not something Thomas valued, and because coming after her would mean admitting to the community that she had left, which would be far more damaging to his reputation than simply allowing her absence to be explained as a visit to a sick relative that had stretched on somewhat longer than expected. She had chosen Redemption Creek specifically because it was small enough that a seamstress might find work quickly and large enough that there was a boarding house. She had read about it in a 2-year-old copy of a Colorado newspaper that she had found in a St. Louis reading room. What she had not fully accounted for was the specific social architecture of a small frontier town in 1883. Redemption Creek sat at the edge of the San Juan mountain range, a town of roughly 400 people that had grown up around a silver mine that had been producing steadily for 8 years, and now employed about a third of the male population. There was a main street with a general store, a bank, a saloon, a church, a doctor's office, a blacksmith, 2 competing mercantile establishments, a livery stable, and a post office. There was a school that met 3 days a week and a town hall that was used for meetings, dances, and events of civic importance. There was also, Annie discovered within her first 72 hours, a rigid and thoroughly enforced social hierarchy that had nothing to do with the official law of the land, and everything to do with how long your family had been there, who your husband was, what his occupation was, and whether the right women had decided to approve of you. The women who ran that hierarchy were led in practice by Dorothea Blanchard, the wife of Gerald Blanchard who owned the bank. Dorothea was 44 years old, had been in Redemption Creek since it was 3 buildings and a muddy track, and had appointed herself the arbiter of social acceptability with an efficiency and thoroughness that any territorial governor would have envied. She was not a malicious woman in the way that Thomas Carver had been malicious. She simply believed, with the absolute conviction of someone who had never had cause to question it, that the social order she had established was correct and natural, and that people who did not fit neatly into it were a problem to be managed. Annie Wells, arriving alone, without a husband or family connection or letter of introduction from anyone Dorothea recognized, presenting herself as a seamstress looking for work, did not fit neatly into anything. She was too well-spoken to be dismissed as ignorant, but she had no husband to establish her social position. She was too obviously capable to be pitied, but she had no resources to be respected. She existed in a kind of social limbo that Dorothea Blanchard found actively unsettling. And what Dorothea found unsettling, the rest of the women in Redemption Creek's social circle found unsettling by extension. The result was that Annie had been turned away from 17 establishments in her first 2 weeks, not rudely in most cases, with the specific polished coldness that was worse than rudeness because it left no handhold, no point of argument, no clear wrong you could name. The dressmaker didn't have room for another seamstress. The boarding house laundry was already managed adequately. The school didn't need another teacher. The hotel didn't need a chambermaid, and so on down the line. What Annie had, at the end of those 2 weeks, was a room she could barely afford at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house, a small amount of piecework she had found through the back door of the dressmaker's shop, because the dressmaker's husband had more human decency than his wife, and had slipped Annie a basket of hemming when Dorothea Blanchard wasn't watching, and a growing, cold, specific understanding that she was going to have to find a way to survive in this town without anyone's help, or she was going to have to leave and start over somewhere else. She was contemplating which of these 2 options was more survivable when she met David McCrae for the second real time, which is to say the first time they actually spoke. She had seen him twice before. Once riding down the main street on a bay horse, his marshal's badge catching the afternoon light, a man of perhaps 32 or 33 with the kind of face that had been made by weather and attention, not handsome in the soft way but striking, with dark eyes under a straight brow, and a jaw that suggested stubbornness had calcified into something close to character. The second time had been outside the post office when she was waiting to ask about general delivery mail, and he had held the door for her without making a production of it, which she had noted because most men in frontier towns either ignored women entirely or made holding a door into an occasion that required extended gratitude. The third time was the day she had gone to the marshal's office to report that someone had gone through her carpetbag in the night. It was not a large theft. She had lost $3 that she had been keeping in the inside pocket of the bag, her remaining cash reserve, which was catastrophic to her situation, but small enough that she had been genuinely uncertain whether to report it. She had gone back and forth on the walk over. She had decided, in the end, that she had a right to report it regardless of whether anything came of it, because she was not going to spend her life in Redemption Creek, behaving as though she had no standing to make claims on public institutions. She walked into the marshal's office at 9 in the morning on a Thursday and found David McCrae sitting at his desk reading a report with a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her for a moment with the careful attentiveness of a man who was professionally in the habit of reading situations quickly. "Good morning," he said. "What can I do for you?" "I need to report a theft," Annie said. "My name is Annie Wells. I'm staying at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house." He wrote her name down without comment. She told him what had happened. He asked questions, clear and practical, without any of the skeptical dismissiveness she had half expected. He wanted to know what time she had gone to sleep, whether she had heard anything, whether the bag had been moved or just searched, whether the latch on her room door was in good repair. "I'll speak to Mrs. Calloway," he said, "and I'll look at the door." "The latch is loose," Annie said. "I noticed it when I arrived. I mentioned it to Mrs. Calloway twice. She hasn't had it fixed." Something shifted in his expression, not quite anger. more like a reckoning, a man who had just been given a piece of information and was filing it accurately. "I'll make sure it's fixed today," he said. "Thank you." She stood to leave. "Miss Wells." He had stood up when she stood, which was a formality she had not been expecting and which did something complicated to her composure. "I'll look into the theft as well. I can't promise anything will come of it, but it'll be looked into properly." She looked at him for a moment. "I appreciate that. You've been having a difficult time since you arrived," he said. It was not a question, and it was not accompanied by pity, which was the thing that saved it from being condescending. It was a simple observation, delivered the way you might observe that it had been a dry summer. "I have," she said, "because lying about it would have been a waste of both their time." "Redemption Creek takes its time with newcomers," he said. "It's not right, but it's true." "I've noticed," Annie said. He met her eyes. "The latch will be fixed today, Miss Wells. You have my word." She walked back to the boarding house in the October morning light turning gold along the mountain edges, and she thought with a kind of cautious, guarded wondering that David McCrae was either a genuinely decent man or an exceptionally good actor. In her experience, those two things were difficult to distinguish until you had time, and time was the one resource she did not currently have in abundance. The latch was fixed that same afternoon. Mrs. Calloway knocked on her door and informed her with a slightly sheepish expression that the marshal had sent the carpenter around. The $3 were never recovered, but something had shifted, and Annie was paying attention. David McCrae had been the marshal of Redemption Creek for 4 years. He had come to the position the way most men came to law enforcement on the frontier, not by design but by accumulation. He had been a rancher's son in Texas, the second of 3 boys, and he had shown from a young age a particular disposition toward order, a discomfort with injustice that went beyond the personal and had teeth in it. His older brother Cal had the ranch. His younger brother James had ridden off to the war when he was 16 and had not come back in any form that resembled the boy who left. David had drifted west and north through his 20s, working cattle drives, spending 2 years as a deputy in a mining camp in New Mexico, and arriving in Colorado at 28 with a reputation for being thorough, fair, and extremely difficult to intimidate. He had also arrived with what he privately thought of as his dark past, which was in fact not a single dramatic event, but rather an accumulation of smaller ones, a pattern he had recognized in himself and was working, with the methodical determination he brought to everything, to undo. He had spent the first 3 years after the war, when he was 19 and 20 and 21, running with a cattle operation that was not entirely legitimate. Nothing that had ever resulted in a formal charge against him, but enough that he knew exactly where the line was between the law and the other side of it because he had stood on both. He had a brother who was currently serving time in a Texas prison. He had a history that made him more useful as a lawman, he believed, than a man who had lived entirely on the right side of things, because he understood how the wrong side worked. He had not told any of this to anyone in Redemption Creek. He had told it to no one, in fact, since a conversation with a dying priest in New Mexico 7 years ago who had listened to David's full accounting and then told him, with considerable directness, that he was spending so much energy managing his guilt that he had none left over for actually living. David had thought about that conversation regularly ever since. He was still working on it. He was also, 4 years into the job, increasingly aware that the social dynamics of Redemption Creek were producing a set of injustices that his badge and authority addressed imperfectly. The law could deal with theft and assault and fraud. It could not deal with Dorothea Blanchard and her network, which operated entirely within the technical boundaries of legality and produced outcomes that were, in his estimation, deeply wrong. He had been watching the situation with Annie Wells with the particular attention of a man who recognized something he understood: the way a town could close itself against a person without ever technically doing anything wrong. He had seen it before. He had been on the receiving end of versions of it himself, in different contexts, when he was younger. He knew what it did to a person over time if nothing intervened. He had not set out to intervene in any deliberate way when the harvest supper came around. He had simply arrived at the town hall, seen Annie Wells standing in the doorway being systematically ignored by 23 people who should have known better, and felt something that had been simmering for 2 weeks come to a full, clear boil. He had picked up the plate that had been set at the head of the table for him, the best seat in the house, his seat by virtue of his office, and he had set it down in front of her. He had moved his own plate beside hers. It had taken about 10 seconds. It had said, in a language everyone in that room understood perfectly, that the Marshal of Redemption Creek had made his position clear, and that anyone who had a problem with Annie Wells being at this table was welcome to take it up with him. Nobody had taken it up with him. They had eaten their harvest supper in a charged and pointed silence that David had found quietly satisfying in a way he was not entirely proud of. Annie had sat beside him and eaten her meal with the composure of a woman who had decided she was not going to let a single person in that room see that she was affected. She had been perfectly polite when he had passed her the corn. She had said thank you with a steadiness that cost her more than she let on, though he could see it if he looked. She had not made a fuss. She had not cried, though he had seen, very briefly, something in her expression when she had first walked toward the chair that told him she was fighting it. He respected that more than he could have easily explained. After the supper, when people had begun filing out in clusters of gossip and lowered voices, he had walked out beside her. The October night was cold, the mountains black against a sky hammered full of stars. "I'm going to hear about that for a month," Annie said, conversationally, as though she were discussing the weather. "Probably 2 months," David agreed. She looked at him sidelong. In the lamplight from the hall windows, her eyes were dark and careful, with something in them that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite fear. "Why?" she said. He considered the question. He could have given her several answers, all of them true. He could have said because it was right. He could have said because he didn't care for the way Dorothea Blanchard ran this town's social register. He could have said because he had been watching her fight alone for 3 weeks, and he had reached the limit of what he was comfortable watching. "Because nobody should eat alone when there's a table full of food," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "Thank you, Marshal McCrae," and walked toward the boarding house. He watched her go with the strong feeling that he had just stepped, voluntarily, into something he had no map for and hadn't made any plan for at all. He was not sure whether that was trouble or something better. He walked back to his office and sat in the dark for a while, which was something he did when he was thinking through something complicated and thought about Annie Wells. The next morning she came to his office with a plate of biscuits. She stood in the doorway with the plate held in both hands, her expression composed with the careful dignity of a woman who had thought this through and decided to do it anyway, and she said, "I thought a proper thank you was warranted. I bake when I have flour, which is not always, but I had some this morning." He stood up. "You didn't need to do that." "I know I didn't need to," she said, which was such a perfectly direct response that he found himself entirely charmed by it. He moved some papers off the corner of his desk and she set the plate down. He offered her coffee from the pot on the stove, which he had just made and which was, for once, not completely terrible. She accepted. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair she had sat in 3 days ago to report the theft, and they talked. They talked for an hour and a half. He had not expected that. He had expected a brief, courteous exchange and then she would leave. Instead, she told him, with the same direct, unvarnished quality he was beginning to recognize as characteristic, that she had been a dressmaker's apprentice before she was married and had good skills at the work, that she had been doing piecework under the table for Henry Marsh at the dressmaker's shop, and that she needed a more reliable income before winter set in or she was going to have a genuine problem. He listened. He asked questions. He found out, piece by piece, that she had left a husband in Missouri and was not looking over her shoulder exactly, but was also not entirely certain she was safe, which told him several things at once about the kind of marriage it had been without her having to say them. He told her in exchange that he had a widowed aunt who had moved to Redemption Creek 2 years ago and who was, he believed, in genuine need of a seamstress because she had mentioned her winter coat needing extensive repair and had been putting it off. He wrote his aunt's name and address on a slip of paper and handed it across the desk. "Tell her I sent you," he said. "She's not part of Dorothea Blanchard's circle. She does things her own way." Annie took the slip of paper. She looked at it, then at him. "You don't have an aunt who needs a seamstress," she said. He held her gaze. "I do," he said. "Her name is Margaret Connolly. She lives on Birch Street, and her winter coat genuinely needs work. I have been meaning to mention it to someone who could help her for 2 months. This is not charity, Miss Wells. This is a practical arrangement that helps two people." She studied him for another moment. Then something in her expression did a very small, very controlled thing that was almost a smile. "All right," she said. Margaret Connolly was 61 years old, had come from Ireland 30 years before, had outlived 2 husbands and most of her original expectations of America, and had arrived at a personal philosophy that could be summarized as, "Do what is right and be direct about your reasoning." She was also, as it turned out, a woman of significant social standing of a different kind than Dorothea Blanchard's. She was liked rather than feared. She had lived long enough and lost enough to have patience for people in difficulty, and no patience whatsoever for cruelty dressed as propriety. When Annie appeared at her door on the morning of October 14, 1883, with David's note in her hand, Margaret opened the door wide before Annie had finished her first sentence. "Come in," she said, looking Annie over with the frank assessment of someone who had been reading people for 60 years. "I've heard about you. My nephew has good judgment. Let's see what you can do with wool." The coat was a significant project. It turned out not to be just the coat. Margaret had a pile of mending and alterations that she had been accumulating and putting off, and she paid Annie in cash at a rate that was more than fair, and that made Annie's financial situation, by the end of the first week, something she could breathe through rather than drown in. She also, within those first 2 weeks of working in Margaret's warm and thoroughly comfortable sitting room, learned several things about David McCrae that Margaret offered freely and without apparent awareness that she was providing information Annie had not asked for and was absorbing with a great deal of attention. He had come to Redemption Creek after a serious personal loss, Margaret said, threading a needle with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. A woman he had intended to marry, killed in a stagecoach accident in New Mexico 2 years before he had come north. He did not talk about it. He had in common with many men of his generation the idea that grief was a private matter to be managed internally, which Margaret considered a nonsense attitude but respected as his own. He had made enemies in his 4 years as marshal, she said, in the way that any honest lawman made enemies. There were men in and around Redemption Creek who had interests in keeping the law flexible, and David McCrae was not a flexible man when it came to his principles. He had made an enemy in particular of a man named Harlan Croft, who ran a freight operation that Margaret described with a raised eyebrow as diversified, meaning it transported silver ore through legitimate channels and other goods through channels that did not appear in the paperwork. He was 32 years old. He liked his coffee black. He had a horse named after a river. He read more than most people expected. He had a fundamental and apparently inexhaustible moral stubbornness that Margaret described as both his greatest virtue and his most frustrating characteristic, depending on whether it was directed at you or at someone else. Annie listened to all of this with the careful attentiveness of a woman who was building a picture and not yet sure what it was a picture of. She thought about him more than she thought was wise. She thought about the way he had set that plate down. The absolute certainty of it, no hesitation, no glance around the room for approval or consensus. Just the decision, made, and executed in a single motion. She had met so few people in her life who moved through the world with that kind of self-possession, the willingness to do the right thing without requiring anyone else to validate the decision first. She told herself it was gratitude, that she was grateful to him, and that gratitude, in her experience, had a way of looking like other things if you weren't careful. She told herself she was not in a position to have feelings for anyone. She was not yet divorced. The law in Colorado in 1883 required her to file papers and wait, and she had filed the papers through a lawyer she had found in Redemption Creek, a process that had cost her 2 weeks of savings and would take several more months to finalize. She was also, by any practical measure, still recovering. She was not sure she trusted her own judgment about people. Thomas had been charming once. She had thought he was a good man once. She was not in a position to simply believe in someone because they had done one decent thing. She told herself all of this very firmly. And then David McCrae came to Margaret's sitting room on a Saturday afternoon, not expecting to find Annie there, but clearly not displeased about it. And he sat down with his aunt's coffee and talked for 2 hours while Annie worked on Margaret's curtains. And she found herself watching the way he gestured when he was working through an argument, and the way his voice changed when he was talking about something he cared about versus something he was simply reporting, and the particular quality of his attention when he listened to someone, which was total and present in a way that made you feel like the only person in the room. She thought, "This is more dangerous than I had understood." He was thinking things he had not thought in 3 years. He noticed her hands first, always busy, needle moving with a quiet efficiency that was something like watching a musician, the work so well practiced it had become almost unconscious. He noticed the way she listened with her whole body, the slight forward lean when something caught her attention. He noticed the way she chose her words carefully, not out of timidity but out of precision, as though she knew the exact weight of language and treated it accordingly. He noticed the scar on the inside of her left wrist that she never explained and that he never asked about, though he had his own dark theories about it that made his jaw tighten when his thoughts went there in the night. He noticed that she laughed rarely, and when she did, it was a real and fully committed laugh with no performance in it, and that each time she laughed it was followed immediately by a brief, private look of surprise, as though she had momentarily forgotten she was capable of it. He thought about that more than was professional or probably sensible. November came in hard, the first real cold dropping down off the mountains with the particular brutality of Colorado altitude. The aspens had long since gone bare, their white trunks stark against the gray sky, and the town pulled inward the way frontier towns did when winter arrived, every social interaction compressed by the cold into a smaller, more intense space. Annie's work situation had improved considerably. Word had gotten out, as word did in small towns, that Margaret Connolly had taken on a seamstress, and Margaret's standing was such that several people who had previously been closed to Annie began approaching her through the back channel of Margaret's recommendation. Not Dorothea Blanchard's circle, but the other half of Redemption Creek's social geography, the people who were simply living their lives without particular interest in the hierarchy. The doctor's wife, a ranching family who needed work done before a daughter's wedding. The school teacher, small things but reliable, and reliability was what Annie needed more than anything. She was beginning to feel, cautiously and with one eye always on the door, something like possibility. The threat arrived on a Tuesday in early November in the form of a letter. She recognized Thomas Carver's handwriting on the envelope before the post office clerk had finished passing it across the counter. She recognized it the way you recognize the sound of a particular footstep, the specific trained alertness of a body that had spent 4 years learning to brace. She took the letter back to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed for 5 minutes before she opened it. Thomas had found out where she was. She was not surprised by this, not exactly, but she had hoped for more time. He had connections in Missouri, a network of business acquaintances, and she should have known that a woman traveling west alone would be traceable if someone was motivated enough and asked the right questions. The letter was 3 pages. The first page was civilized, the voice of a man who was managing his temper carefully and wanted to appear reasonable. He was simply concerned for her welfare. She had made a rash decision under the influence of a temporary unhappiness. He was prepared to forgive the embarrassment she had caused him. He wished her to come home. The second page was less civilized. There were observations about her character. There were reminders of what he had provided for her and what she owed him. There was a reference to the forged letter of reference that told her he had been thorough in his investigation, and that she should understand she was exposed in a way he could choose to make very uncomfortable. The third page was the threat. He had hired a man to come to Redemption Creek and verify that she was there and in what circumstances she was living, and he wanted her to know that whatever she had built here could be dismantled. He had friends in Colorado, he wrote. Not in Redemption Creek perhaps, but nearby enough. Annie read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat where she kept the letter she had written to herself 6 months ago, the one that said she deserved better. She made herself sit for another 20 minutes, breathing slowly, letting the fear run through her without letting it take over. She had learned this over the 4 years, the difference between feeling afraid and being controlled by fear. Fear was information. Fear was telling her something real, but fear did not get to make decisions for her. She thought about her options. She could leave. Leave Redemption Creek before Thomas's man arrived, start over somewhere else, which would solve the immediate problem and reset the entire accumulation she had built over the past 6 weeks. She could wait and see what Thomas's man did when he arrived, hoping that his report back to Missouri was sufficiently discouraging. She could go to a lawyer, though the divorce proceeding was already in motion, and she was not sure what additional legal protection was available to her. Or she could tell the marshal. She sat with that option for a long time. It felt like asking for help, which she had trained herself not to do over 4 years because asking for help had been a vulnerability that Thomas exploited. But that was Thomas's logic, not her own, and she had been working carefully on distinguishing between Thomas's logic and her own. David McCrae was not Thomas Carver. She was increasingly, carefully certain of that. She went to his office the next morning. She told him the full truth. Not the carefully managed partial version. The full version, Thomas Carver, the 4 years, the forged letter, the divorce proceedings, the threat in the letter. She told it with the same flat composure she used for everything, watching his face. His face did several things. Anger, controlled but visible, specifically when she mentioned the scar on her wrist, which she explained for the first time because it was part of the story and she had decided to tell the full truth. The scar was old, from a night 2 years into the marriage when Thomas had been more careless than usual with his discipline. She said this plainly, without flinching, and watched David McCrae's jaw tighten in a way that told her it had landed as the serious thing it was. He did not perform sympathy. He did not say things that required her to manage his reaction. He listened until she was finished, and then he asked several practical questions. What was the name Thomas had used for the man he was sending? Did she know anything about Thomas's supposed Colorado connections? Did she have all the documentation for the divorce proceeding? She had anticipated 2 of these questions and could answer them. The third she could not. "I'll look into the Colorado connection," he said. "The forged letter is a problem, but it's a minor one in the context of what you've described. The letter you received is arguably more legally problematic for him than the reference is for you, given its contents. I'm not sure a court would see it that way. Possibly not," he said, "but it would be a conversation worth having with the lawyer." He paused. "I'm glad you told me." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because it means I can actually do something useful," he said, "instead of just watching." There it was. The acknowledgement that he had been watching, that he had been paying attention, that her situation had been on his mind. She had known it was true. Hearing him say it did something to her chest that she was not prepared to manage efficiently. "Thank you," she said, more quietly than the other times she had said it. He met her eyes. For a moment neither of them said anything, and the office was very quiet, and the late autumn light came through the one window in a long rectangle across the floor, and Annie Wells thought with absolute clarity that she was in serious difficulty here, and that there was a strong possibility that she did not mind. The man Thomas Carver had sent arrived in Redemption Creek on November 17th. His name was Roy Fenwick, and he was a private investigator from Kansas City who had been hired to locate Annie and assess her situation and report back. He was not a dangerous man in any direct physical sense. He was a middle-aged, methodical, professionally detached man who checked into the hotel and began quietly asking questions around town. He was not subtle enough for a town where the marshal paid attention. David had him identified within 12 hours and knew everything relevant about his background within 24, through the combination of a telegram to the marshal's office in Kansas City and a quiet conversation with two people at the hotel who owed David favors. He did not arrest Fenwick, because Fenwick had not done anything arrestable. He did, however, sit across from him in the hotel dining room on the morning of the third day and have a conversation that lasted about 45 minutes, at the end of which Fenwick checked out of the hotel and took the next stage south. He told Annie about it that afternoon, walking beside her along the main street on the way to Margaret's house, where she was expected for a fitting. "He'll report to Carver that you're here," David said. "I can't prevent that. But he'll also report that you're not alone here, that you're established, that you have the support of people in this community. That makes you a less easy target." Annie was quiet for a moment, watching the street ahead. The cold was sharp, her breath pluming white. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "The truth," David said, "that you have friends here, and that the law in Redemption Creek is very interested in any harassment of its residents." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She looked at him directly, the way she had on the night of the harvest supper, that careful, assessing look that made him feel like she was reading something in him that he had not written down anywhere. "Friends," she said. "Yes," he said. She was close enough that he could see the cold had put color high in her cheeks, close enough that he could see the careful control she was holding, the place where the control was not quite complete. "David," she said, using his name for the first time, and the sound of it in her voice did something unreasonable to his composure. "Yes," he said again, which was not a complete sentence but was, he felt, accurate. "I think you should know," she said, "that I am not a woman who behaves foolishly. I have been careful my whole life, sometimes at great personal cost, and I intend to continue being careful. But I also think I have been honest with you about everything else, and it would be inconsistent to be dishonest about this." She paused. "I find myself thinking about you more than is strictly rational." He looked at her for a long moment. The street was busy around them, horses and wagons and people going about the business of a November afternoon, and neither of them moved. "I find myself thinking about you more than is strictly anything," he said. Something happened in her expression then, something that started as relief and moved quickly into something warmer and more complicated and deeply honest. She looked down at the street for a moment and then back at him. "My divorce will be final in March," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you that because I think it's important to be clear about what is and isn't possible right now. I understand that." "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." They walked the rest of the way to Margaret's house in a silence that was nothing like the silence before. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who have just said something that cannot be unsaid, and are now deciding what to do with the fact of it, which is a pleasant kind of silence even when it is complicated. Margaret opened the door before they knocked, looked at them both, and said, "You two look like you've had a conversation," in a tone that suggested she had opinions about this that she was temporarily restraining. "We have," Annie said. "Good," Margaret said. "Come in, I'll make tea." The winter months were a particular kind of beautiful in Redemption Creek, the snow heavy on the mountain peaks and the spruce trees, the town quiet in the way that cold and isolation make things quiet, turned inward and focused. Annie worked steadily through December, her reputation as a seamstress now established enough through Margaret's referrals that she was busier than she had expected. The social barriers that had initially closed against her thawing slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. She and David fell into a rhythm that was careful and tender and deeply, deliberately slow, which was right for where she was, and he understood it without needing to be told explicitly more than once. He walked with her on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted. He came to Margaret's sitting room on Saturday evenings, and the three of them played cards and drank tea and talked about everything from territorial politics to what Margaret had observed about human nature over 61 years, which was a great deal. He brought her books from his personal collection, which was larger and more eclectic than anyone in Redemption Creek knew about, because he had been private about his reading habits in the same way he was private about most things. She lent him her careful attention and her specific quality of honesty, which he had found, over 4 years of the particular loneliness of his job and his private grief, to be the thing he most needed. She did not perform certainty she didn't feel. She did not manage his feelings or smooth over her own. She told him the truth, consistently, even when the truth was complicated or incomplete. She told him about Nashville. She told him about her father's rigid and unkind form of religious authority, the specific shape it had given her childhood. She told him about marrying Thomas Carver not because she loved him but because she had been afraid of what refusing would mean, and because she had believed, with the terrible hope of a 20-year-old, that she could make it work. He told her about New Mexico, about the woman named Claire who had been 26 and who had died on the road between Santa Fe and Albuquerque in 1878, and who he had loved with the whole-bodied certainty of a man who had not yet learned that the world was indifferent to the things you were certain about. He had not talked about Claire in 3 years. He told Annie about her carefully and completely, in the way that you can tell someone about the people you have lost when you trust them enough, when you believe that the telling will be received properly. She had put her hand over his when he finished. Just her hand over his on the table in Margaret's sitting room, Margaret having diplomatically gone to the kitchen, and they had sat like that for a while, in the particular shared quiet of two people who have survived losses that have not defeated them, and who are beginning to recognize in each other something that is worth the risk of trying again. In January, Thomas Carver made one more attempt. He contacted, through his supposed Colorado connections, a man named Harlan Croft. It was a mistake on Thomas's part, because he did not know that Harlan Croft was already David McCrae's specific and ongoing professional concern, or that the two men's connection would serve, ultimately, to resolve both problems simultaneously. Harlan Croft had been running his freight operations' less legitimate activities through a network that David had been building a case against for 8 months. The evidence was almost complete. Croft dealt in misrepresented goods, forged shipping manifests, and had a sideline in providing certain services to men who wanted things done without a paper trail. Thomas Carver had approached him through a mutual acquaintance, offering payment for the delivery of a specific message to Annie Wells, a message designed to frighten her sufficiently to abandon her divorce proceeding and return to Missouri. The man Croft sent to deliver this message went instead to David's office, because the man Croft sent was someone David had been quietly cultivating as a source for 7 months, and because this particular man had a conscience that had been inconveniencing him for some time, and had decided that this was the point at which it became untenable to ignore. David moved quickly. He had enough, with the addition of Thomas Carver's money and the specific request it funded, to bring Croft in. He arrested Harlan Croft on a Thursday morning in late January 1884, on charges of operating a fraudulent commercial enterprise and conspiracy to harass, with the paperwork extensive and airtight, the result of 8 months of careful work. He sent a separate telegram to the marshal's office in Benton, Missouri, informing them that Thomas Carver had hired an agent to harass a resident of Redemption Creek, Colorado, and that the documentation of this was available should it be relevant to any proceedings in their jurisdiction. He also sent a second telegram to Annie's lawyer in Colorado with the same documentation as supplemental evidence in the divorce proceeding. He told Annie all of this in Margaret's sitting room, sitting across from her in the late January afternoon with the snow coming down outside and the wood stove going. He laid it out plainly, what had happened and what it meant. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment. "The divorce proceeding," she said. "Does this help?" "Significantly," he said. "Your lawyer believes it will accelerate the timeline, possibly as early as February rather than March." She absorbed this. He watched her, the firelight moving across her face, her hand still for once in her lap. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked at him, and for the first time since he had known her, the careful, composed surface was not entirely in place. Not broken exactly. More like she had decided deliberately to let it down. "I have been afraid," she said, "for 5 years. I have been afraid of Thomas, afraid of poverty, afraid of being alone, afraid of what people would say and think, afraid that I had made too many mistakes that couldn't be undone. And I am tired of being afraid." She paused. "I think I am finally tired enough to stop." He said nothing. He understood from everything she had told him that this was not a simple thing to say. "I know my divorce isn't final yet," she said. "It will be," he said. "And I know you have been patient," she said. "More patient than you needed to be." "It wasn't patience," he said. "It was where I wanted to be." She looked at him steadily. Then she said, "Come and sit beside me." And he moved to the settle beside her without hesitation. And she took his hand the way she had at Christmas, both hands around his, and they sat together watching the fire and listening to the snow come down outside, and neither of them needed to say anything because it had all been said, piece by piece over 4 months, and what was left was just the two of them in a warm room together. February came. The divorce papers arrived, signed and stamped and formally complete, on the 14th of February 1884. Which was a coincidence that made Margaret laugh out loud when Annie showed her over tea. That evening, David McCrae came to the boarding house, which was not their usual arrangement, and knocked at the front door and asked Mrs. Calloway if Miss Wells was available, which caused Mrs. Calloway to get a very specific expression that suggested she had been waiting for this event for some time. He was shown into the small parlor. Annie came downstairs. He had brought her a book. It was a volume of poetry, Walt Whitman, the 1881 edition, which he had ordered from a bookseller in Denver 2 months ago when he had realized, with the specific quiet certainty of a man who has been watching himself fall in love and has stopped trying to resist it, that he was going to want to give it to her eventually. Inside the front cover he had written, in his careful and slightly angular hand, a single line. "For the woman who reminded me that some things are worth the risk." She read it standing in the parlor while he stood 3 feet away watching her face. She looked up at him. She was 32 days out of 5 years of a marriage that had dismantled her confidence piece by piece, 3 months out of the worst financial insecurity she had ever lived through, and she was standing in a small boarding house parlor in Redemption Creek, Colorado, holding a book of poems, looking at a man who had set her plate down before his own in front of an entire room full of people, and had never in 4 months given her a single reason to doubt him. She said, "David," just his name. He said, "Annie," and she crossed the 3 feet between them in 2 steps, and he met her halfway, and the first time he kissed her was gentle and certain and completely unhurried, the way he did most things, with full conviction and no reservation. They were engaged before March was out. He asked her properly, one Sunday afternoon in late March when the snow had begun to soften at the edges, and you could smell the earliest hint of spring coming up from the lower elevations, on a walk along the creek that gave the town its name. He stopped walking. He turned to face her. He told her that he loved her, that he had been in love with her since approximately 30 seconds after she had sat down beside him at the harvest table and eaten her chicken with that magnificent composed dignity, and that he wanted to marry her if she was willing, and that he understood if she needed more time but that he was ready whenever she was. She said yes before he finished the sentence. She said yes and then laughed at herself for saying it before he'd finished asking, and then they were both laughing there by the creek with the first spring melt coming off the mountains. And it was a different kind of laugh than the ones he had been collecting, not the rare, surprised laughter of a woman who had forgotten she was capable of it, but something new, something easy and warm and unguarded, the laugh of a woman who was safe enough to simply be happy. They were married on the last Saturday of May 1884, in the church on the main street, with the Reverend Simmons presiding and Margaret Connolly in the front pew and approximately half of Redemption Creek in attendance, including, in the back row, several people from Dorothea Blanchard's social circle, who had apparently decided to revise their assessment of Annie Wells now that it had become evident she was going to marry the Marshal. Annie had noted their presence with a private amusement she had shared with Margaret the night before, and Margaret had said, with considerable satisfaction, that the best revenge was a happy life well lived in full view of everyone who had tried to prevent it. The wedding itself was small by the standards Annie had grown up with, but genuine in every aspect, which was more than she could say for most formal occasions she had attended in her life. She wore a dress she had made herself, dove-gray silk she had ordered from Denver, simple and very well cut, and she carried the first wildflowers that had come up in the field behind Margaret's house, yellow and purple in her hands. David stood at the altar looking like a man who had made a decision about the rest of his life and was entirely at peace with it, which was, she thought, exactly what he looked like about everything once he had made his mind up. He looked at her when she came down the aisle the way he looked at her in the marshal's office on that first morning with the biscuits, the way he had looked at her across the harvest table, with that total and present attention that made her feel like the only thing in his field of vision. She thought, walking toward him, that this was what it was supposed to feel like: the absence of fear, the presence of something so solid and so warm that she could lean into it without calculation. She said her vows in a clear, steady voice. So did he. When Reverend Simmons said he could kiss his bride, he did, and the assembled half of Redemption Creek made a sound that was half applause and half satisfied laughter, and Margaret Connolly wiped her eyes with her handkerchief and made no attempt to conceal it. The summer of 1884 in Redemption Creek was warm and long and full. Annie moved into David's house, a solid 2-story frame house on the east side of town that he had built 4 years ago with the intention of eventually filling it, and had lived in alone since. It was comfortable and clean and had good bones, as Margaret said approvingly on her first visit, and needed the kind of life in it that one person alone could not generate. Annie filled it methodically and with pleasure, because she had never in her adult life had a space that was genuinely hers, and the act of making a home that was fully her own, with full authority and no fear, was a slow and absorbing joy. She continued her seamstress work, because she had built something real in it, and because the independence of earning her own money meant something to her that she had no intention of giving up simply because she no longer needed it to survive. David understood this completely and had never suggested otherwise, which was one of approximately 47 things she loved about him. She had made a full accounting of those things in a letter she had written to herself in June, a new letter to replace the old one that had said she deserved better. This one was longer and more specific, and it began, "I have found the life I was looking for, and it is more than I had the courage to imagine when I was 26 years old on a train platform in St. Louis. In July, news came from Missouri. Thomas Carver had been investigated by the Benton Marshal's office, following the telegram David had sent in January. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of financial irregularities in his business that had resulted in charges against him in Missouri, which had nothing directly to do with Annie, but which had the effect of ensuring that he would be occupied with his own considerable legal problems for the foreseeable future. Her lawyer confirmed that there was no remaining legal claim on her person, her freedom, or her future. She was, in every formal sense, free. She told David that evening, sitting on the porch of their house in the summer dusk with the mountains going copper behind them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, because it was him and because she had made a practice of being fully honest with him, and also something more than all right, something I don't have the exact word for. "Relief," he said. "More than that. Completion," he tried. She thought about it. "Yes," she said, "completion." She leaned against his shoulder. His arm came around her. "I wrote myself a letter in June," she said, "about how things are now. I want you to know that it's a very good letter." "I'm glad," he said, pressing his mouth to the top of her head. They stayed on the porch until the stars came out, and the mountains went from copper to gray to black against the navy sky, and the town went quiet around them, and it was, Annie thought, one of the most straightforwardly good evenings she had ever spent. In the autumn, Annie discovered she was expecting a child. She told David on a Thursday morning in October, sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee, which had become a daily ritual she loved, the 20 minutes before the day properly started when they simply sat together. She told him in the same direct way she told him most things, with the same straight look, watching his face. His face did something she had never quite seen before. It started with something stunned and moved through something raw and arrived at something so open and so joyful that she felt her own throat tighten in response. He got up from his chair and came around the table and held her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment. And then he said, "Annie," in a way that contained everything he had ever felt about her compressed into 2 syllables. "I know," she said, and she meant all of it, everything the word contained. Margaret, when told, produced a bottle of Irish whiskey that she had been keeping in a cabinet for occasions of genuine significance, and poured 3 glasses, and made a toast that was, characteristically, both sentimental and completely to the point. To the people who don't give up on the idea that things can get better. They're usually the ones that deserve it most. The winter of 1884 and early 1885 was the first winter Annie Wells had spent in Redemption Creek, and it was entirely different from the first one. She was known now. She was respected, in the genuine sense of the word rather than the social performance sense. She had customers who brought their work to her as a matter of preference and loyalty, not just because the alternative seamstress was busy. She had friends, real ones, built over the months of doing honest work and being honest herself. She had Margaret, who was grandmother in every sense that mattered and who had apparently been waiting for someone to be grandmother to for quite some time. She had David, who came home every evening to the house that was a home now, who sat with her while she worked in the evenings, reading or writing his reports, the 2 of them occupying the same space in the particular comfortable ease of people who have decided to be entirely honest with each other and have discovered that it makes everything simpler. He was a good man. She had known it from the beginning, with the cautious, provisional certainty of a woman who had learned not to trust her first assessments. She had tested it over time, as carefully and as fairly as she knew how, and it had held. He was consistent. He was honest with her even when the honest thing was complicated. He made mistakes and admitted them. He had a moral stubbornness that occasionally made her want to argue with him, and that she had come to think of as one of his finest qualities. He loved her with the same total, present, unhurried attention he gave to everything, and she had stopped being surprised by it and started depending on it in the way you depend on the things that are genuinely reliable. She thought sometimes about the girl she had been in Nashville, watching her father move through the world with such certainty about who deserved what and who had standing and who did not. She thought about 19-year-old Annie standing at the front of a church in Missouri, telling herself this would be fine. It would work. She would make it work. She thought about the woman on the train platform in St. Louis with 40 cents, and a letter she had written to herself, and a destination chosen from a 2-year-old newspaper. She thought about walking into the town hall of Redemption Creek with Mrs. Calloway's envelope, and the moment when she had understood that no one was going to make space for her, and the moment immediately after when a plate had come down on the table in front of an empty chair, and a man she barely knew had looked at her and said ma'am with that one word containing everything that had happened since. She would not trade it. Not any of it, not the hard parts, because the hard parts were how she had gotten to this. The hard parts were how she had become someone who could be loved properly and could love properly in return. Someone who had tested herself enough to know what she was made of. Someone who had fought her way to a table of her own. Their son was born on March 3rd, 1885. He arrived, as David later described it, with the understatement of a man who had been considerably more alarmed in the moment than he was prepared to admit publicly, rather quickly, and with great enthusiasm. The doctor made it in time, barely. Margaret was there before the doctor, having apparently decided that proximity to the event was more important than propriety, and had been more useful than 3 extra doctors would have been. They named him William, for no specific ancestor, but because it was a name they had both separately liked and had arrived at independently and identically, which David said was evidence of something, and Annie said was a coincidence, and Margaret said was both. William David McCrae came into the world at 4 in the morning with the vigorous opinions and clear voice of someone who intended to make his presence known immediately and consistently, which he proceeded to do. He had his father's dark eyes and what Margaret declared was Annie's stubbornness, and he was, from the first hour, the exact center of something that had already been full. Annie lay in the bedroom that had been hers for 10 months, in the house that was fully home now, with William in the crook of her arm and David sitting on the edge of the bed beside her, his hand over both of theirs, and she thought about being 26 years old on a train platform in St. Louis with 40 cents and a carpetbag, and she thought that she could not have predicted a single thing about what was coming. Not Margaret. Not the seamstress work or the harvest supper or the plate on the table or the dark-eyed Marshal who had sat down beside her and stayed. Not the divorce and the spring and the creek and the poems and the wedding in May. Not this. Not this warm and particular and irreplaceable morning, with her son and her husband in this house in the mountains and the light coming up pink through the bedroom window. She thought, this is what it means to have a life. David looked at her and she looked at him, and William made a small and entirely authoritative sound between them, and they both laughed quietly so as not to startle him. "Good morning," David said to his son, in the tone of a man addressing someone he intends to take very seriously. William closed his eyes with the decisive contentment of someone who has made his appearance, established his presence, and is now prepared to rest. "He knows already," Margaret said from the doorway, carrying tea she had made in the kitchen below because Margaret had decided that this was a tea occasion and had acted accordingly. "That he's wanted. They can feel it, even that small." Annie took the tea with her free hand. She looked at Margaret in the doorway, at David beside her, at William asleep against her side. "Yes," she said, "he can." The years that followed in Redemption Creek were full in the way that good lives are full, not without difficulty or grief or complication, but threaded through with something that gave those things context and proportion. David continued as Marshal, and the town grew around him, the silver mine still producing, the railroad coming through in 1887, and bringing with it 200 new residents and the specific chaos of a frontier town changing into something more permanent. He dealt with it with his characteristic thoroughness and his specific form of principled stubbornness, which the town council had learned to work with rather than against. Annie's seamstress business grew into a proper shop on the main street, a development that occurred in 1886 when Henry Marsh retired and offered Annie the lease on the dressmaker's building at a rate that was an act of deliberate kindness from a man who had been paying it back for 3 years. She had 2 women working for her by 1888, the shop established and respected. The social barriers that had greeted her 5 years earlier so thoroughly dissolved that most people who had been there for it had a difficult time accurately remembering the sequence of events. Dorothea Blanchard had not, in the end, become a friend. But she had arrived at a grudging and eventually genuine respect, the specific product of watching Annie Wells work with consistent excellence for 5 years and being unable, even with considerable effort, to find any specific fault with the result. She had come to the shop in 1887 with an elaborate request for a gown for her daughter's engagement party, and she and Annie had had a conversation about the work that was, by common agreement of both parties, simply a professional conversation between equals, and that was the foundation on which they proceeded. It was not forgiveness. Annie was not required to forgive a woman who had never acknowledged wrongdoing and who had, in her way, made Annie's first terrible months in Redemption Creek significantly worse. But it was a pragmatic peace, and in a small town, that had its own value. Margaret Connolly continued to be Margaret Connolly, which was one of the great constants of their lives. She was at every birthday and every crisis and every occasion of significance. She had opinions about everything and shared them freely, and was right often enough that her opinions had genuine standing. William adored her with the totality that small children direct at people who give them complete and delighted attention, and she adored him back with an equal completeness. In 1887, Annie had their second child, a daughter they named Clara after no specific ancestor either, but because both of them heard it and knew immediately that it was right. Clara arrived in September with David's dark eyes and hair, but, from the first days, a temperament that was her own particular creation, patient where William was energetic, observant where he was expressive, with a quality of attention even as an infant that made you feel she was taking in far more than she was ready to report. David held her in the first hour with the same expression he had worn holding William, the open and unreserved joy of a man who had made peace with being fully happy, who had stopped treating his own happiness as a provisional thing. Annie watched him with their daughter in the lamplit bedroom, and felt the specific and layered feeling of a woman who has had several years to absorb the fact that her life is genuinely good and still finds it, regularly, surprising in its fullness. William was 2 years old and deeply interested in Clara in the way of a toddler who has been informed that a significant person is arriving and has been trying to prepare adequately and is discovering that the reality is more interesting than the preparation. He sat on the bed beside Annie and looked at Clara very seriously. "She is small," he announced. "She is," Annie agreed. "I was small," he said, processing this. "You were," David said. "You were extremely small. You had very strong opinions about it even then." William appeared to find this satisfactory. He patted Clara's hand with the gentle, careful touch of someone who has been told several times that small things are handled carefully, and Clara, 8 hours old, turned her head toward him with the unfocused tracking of a newborn, and William looked up at Annie and David with an expression of pure and startled delight. "She knows me," he said. "She does," Annie said. She pulled her son in against her side, her daughter in the crook of her other arm, and David sat at the foot of the bed, looking at all 3 of them with an expression that she recognized as his specifically. The one that was not quite a smile, but that contained all the warmth of one, the expression of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. In 1889, Colorado became the 38th state, which was an event of considerable significance in Redemption Creek, celebrated with a town-wide supper that bore a certain resemblance to the harvest supper of 5.5 years before, except that this time Annie Wells, who had long since become Annie McCrae, came in through the front door of the town hall with her husband and her children, and sat down at a table that had been saved for them by 3 separate people who had been hoping to sit near the Marshall's family. She noticed this. She noticed it with the particular awareness of a woman who remembers what it felt like when the opposite was true. She sat William on one side of her and Clara on the other. David sat beside her, his shoulder against hers, and she thought about the first time she had sat beside him in this room, the quiet revolution of a plate set down before her, the beginning of everything. She put her hand over his under the table. He turned his hand over and held hers, without looking away from the conversation he was having with the man on his other side. The unconscious ease of a man who has been holding his wife's hand for 5 years and considers it as natural as breathing. William was eating cornbread with great concentration. Clara was looking around the room with her characteristic comprehensive attentiveness, cataloging the world as she found it. Annie looked at the room, full of people she knew now, people she had dressed and argued with and helped and been helped by, people who were the texture of a life lived fully in one place over time. She thought about the train platform in St. Louis. She thought about the letter she had written to herself that said she deserved better, and the letter she had written 5 years later that said she had found it. She thought she should probably write a new letter. This one would be different from both the others. It would not be about deserving or finding, because those were the language of wanting something you didn't have. It would be about having it, about the specific weight of a life that contained real things, real people, real love, built stone by stone over the years in a town in the Colorado mountains where nobody had made space for her until someone did, decisively and completely, and changed everything. She thought she would write it in the autumn, in the shop on the main street, on a quiet afternoon when the children were at Margaret's and David was making his rounds, in the good quiet of a room that was entirely hers. She thought it would begin simply, "This is what I found." Outside the town hall windows, Redemption Creek spread itself in the September evening, the mountain steady at its back, the sky going from blue to gold to the first deep copper of a western sunset, the streets full of people celebrating a new statehood that was in some ways only the official recognition of something that had already been true for years. That this was a permanent place, that it had been chosen and built and stayed in, that it was home. David leaned close to her ear and said, quietly in the middle of the noise and the celebration, "You're thinking something." "I'm always thinking something," she said. "You're thinking it with a specific expression," he said. "The one that means it's something good." She turned to look at him. The lamplight of the hall was warm on his face, and he was looking at her with that total attention, the look she had fallen in love with before she had words for it, the look that said she was the only thing in his field of vision even in a room full of people. "I was thinking," she said, "that I am very glad I came to Redemption Creek." He smiled, the full and unhurried smile that she had spent the first 2 months knowing him carefully cataloging because it was rare and therefore extraordinary. "So am I," he said. And she said, "I was thinking that I want to have another baby." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression that was the cousin of the look he had given her when she told him about William, the same open and entirely unguarded joy. "We can discuss that," he said, which was his way of saying yes before he'd heard the full proposal. "I think we should discuss it tonight," she said. "That seems like a reasonable timeline," he said. She laughed, and it was the easy, warm, unguarded laugh that was all hers, the one she had found in the spring of 1884 by the creek with the snow melting off the mountains, the one she had not known she was capable of for most of her life, and that now came as naturally as breathing. Clara, who had been listening with her characteristic comprehensive attention, looked up at her mother and then at her father and announced, with considerable authority for a 2-year-old, "Baby." William stopped eating cornbread. "Are we getting a baby?" "Perhaps," David said. "I want a boy this time," William said with the confidence of someone who considers his input determinative. "We will take what we're given," Annie said, "and be glad of it." "But a boy would be good," William said. "Any baby would be good," Annie said. Clara patted the table in a way that seemed to indicate agreement, and then returned to looking at the room with her wide, cataloging eyes, and William returned to the cornbread, and David put his arm around Annie's shoulders, and the town of Redemption Creek celebrated its statehood around them, and everything was, in the most complete and specific and fully realized sense of the word, exactly right. The third child was born in the spring of 1890, when the aspens were greening and the creek was full with snowmelt, arriving easily and with considerably less drama than his older brother had produced, which Margaret said reflected a calmer temperament, and William said was because he was glad to be here, which was the kind of thing William said that made Annie and David look at each other with the same expression. They named him Thomas, not for Annie's former husband but for David's grandfather, a deliberate reclaiming of a name from its worst association, which was something Annie had thought about and proposed herself, finding a private satisfaction in the act of choosing to put something good where something bad had been. Thomas McCrae arrived in April and immediately set about establishing, with the unhurried certainty of his father and the specific quiet intensity of his mother, that he was entirely at home in the world. Margaret held him in the rocking chair in the kitchen, which had become her chair by long occupation, and sang him a song in Irish that she had been singing since before Annie had arrived in Redemption Creek, and that she had sung to William and Clara, and that she would sing, she said with complete matter-of-fact certainty, for as long as she was around to sing it. William stood in the doorway watching with the proprietary interest of a 5-year-old who has now been through this twice and considers himself experienced. Clara sat on the floor near Margaret's chair with her blocks, building something with the patient architectural focus she brought to everything, occasionally looking up at the baby with an expression that was already beginning to look like the particular affectionate tolerance of an older sister. David was in the kitchen doorway, his arm around Annie, both of them watching their family inhabit the room. 4 children, he said quietly, so only she heard. 3, she said. 4, he said. You're forgetting Margaret. Annie looked at Margaret in the rocking chair, singing in Irish to Thomas, who was asleep and entirely unconcerned, and then at William in the doorway conducting some private assessment of the situation, and then at Clara and her blocks on the floor. Fair, she said. He pressed a kiss to her temple. She leaned into him. Outside, the April morning was warming, the mountains still snow-capped but the valley below the town green and beginning, the creek audible from the kitchen window. Running full and clear over the stones, it had been running over for 10,000 years before any of them arrived, and would run over for 10,000 more. She thought about what she had written in her letter in the autumn of 1889, the third letter, the one that had begun. This is what I found. She had found this. This kitchen, this family, these mountains at her back, this man who had set a plate down on a table in front of an empty chair and changed the direction of her life with a single, unhesitating act of simple human decency. She had found the thing she had not been able to imagine clearly enough to ask for directly, because she had not known, at 26 on that train platform, that this specific and particular and irreplaceable version of it existed. She had known, in the abstract, that things could be better. She had not known that better had this specific address. She thought she should write a 4th letter, eventually, not about deserving or finding or having. She thought the 4th letter would be about building, about the difference between arriving somewhere and making something, about the daily specific work of a life that was genuinely good, the choices made and remade, the ordinary mornings and the extraordinary ones, the way love over the years became less a feeling that happened to you and more a thing you actively, continuously, gladly chose. She would write it when the children were older and the town was quieter and she had the long autumn afternoons that she could see, in prospect, waiting for her. She would write it for herself, the way all the letters had been for herself, because she had learned that the truest things were the ones you said when no one else was listening. But she knew already how it would begin. It would begin the way the whole story had begun, with a plate set down on a table in October 1883, with the sound of a chair pulled out, with a man looking at her and saying ma'am in a voice that contained an entire argument about who deserved what in this world and what a person was worth. It would begin. Nobody had saved her a place at any table until the marshal set her plate down before his own. And from that single moment, which lasted less than 10 seconds and changed everything, she had built the best life she could imagine. She had built it here. She was still building it now. And she intended, with the methodical and unhurried determination that had carried her from a train platform in Missouri to a kitchen in the Colorado mountains, to keep building it for the rest of her life.